Hey class, welcome back. I hope you guys are doing well. Well, this is our this is going to be it. This is our final video here for this semester. Today's video is going to be quite long. Okay, the reason I did that is we're going to be talking about the Crusades, and it's going to take us a while to get through it. So this video is going to probably be about an hour long. So on Moodle, it's going to be basically one video for session 1 and 2. So if you're maybe following along, which you're probably not, but if you're following along with the idea of in the classroom, my classroom students have class Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So I would do this lecture on Tuesday and then continuing it on Wednesday. And then Thursday is going to be basically study guide for the final exam and maybe a quick review. But the video today, about an hour long. If you want to break it into 2 sessions, go ahead and do it. Break it into 2 sessions. A lot of information about the Crusades. It's just a massive topic. One of the things I told my class last week in the classroom was that when I went for my bachelor's degree in history, modern European history, medieval history really fascinates me. I really like that time period also, even though it's kind of before modern European history. And I took several classes for my bachelor's degree in medieval history. And so I took the early Middle Ages, the Central Middle Ages, and the High Middle Ages. So I got 9 credits just in the Middle Ages. And the Crusades, it fascinates me how these kind of things take place. How a group of people, the Muslims, they take the Holy Land, and they've had it for a long time. They have the Holy Land for a long time, and the Pope in Europe decides, hey, we need to go kick the Muslims out of the Holy Land. And so the Crusades take place. Now, there are several of them, a good number of Crusades. But the way that the armies are recruited and the kings go about in leading these armies and going down to the Holy Land, and it seems like they just have like no real idea of what they're doing. Even though they do have some successes, it turns out to be a big bust. Because in the end, after all of this, and the Crusades are almost 200 years long also. It's not just like a couple of Crusades in one like person's lifetime or a certain pope. There's several popes. These Crusades, they take place over almost 200 years. And in the end of all of it, the Muslims still retain control of almost all of the Holy Land. So we're going to be looking at that today. Now, there's debate about how many Crusades there really are. Some historians, I think I say on one of the PowerPoint slides maybe has the number of how many Crusades there are. Some historians believe that there were up to 9 Crusades. Others, most historians believe it's around 7 Crusades, and it's because there were some unofficial Crusades that actually take place. One of them is it fascinates me. It's called the Children's Crusade. I wrote a paper about the Children's Crusade for one of my history classes because it's unbelievable what takes place. I mean, I'm a father of 4 children. I have 4 children. My wife and I have 4 children, and for parents to let their kids, their teenagers basically, go from Europe down towards the Holy Land. They don't even make it in the Crusade. We'll talk about that in the PowerPoint. But for them to allow their children to do this, it fascinates me how that can happen. Unfortunately, because of the amount of information on the Crusades, like I said, I took 3 classes on this, 9 credit hours. I mean, full credit, semester-long classes on these time periods. We can't cover all the details of the Crusades. I wish we could, but we can't. So again, this is kind of fly over the Crusades and hit the points we need to hit, and then move on to the next crusade. But it is important that you know this, and especially in regards to medieval history, European history. So you're going to need to know. You're going to need to know for the exam, and the questions that will be on the study guide in regards to the Crusades. That's what you'll need to know for the exam. So this video again is long. Break it up over the week to have like 3 sessions if you want, or 2 sessions. But the amount of material that's going into this video today and your notes that you'll be taking is definitely going to be a week's worth of information. So even though it's one video this week, it's going to be the full week of information. So, you break it up over 2 days or so, and you'll be good to go. And then look on Moodle, look for that study guide here at the end of the week. Okay, class, we're going to move now into our 4th PowerPoint here, the Middle Ages. And today, as I've said in the introduction, we will be talking about the Crusades. The history of the Crusades is it's a pretty vast topic, and there are many Crusades. Some historians count up to 9 Crusades because some of the different movements may not have even been actually Crusades. But the ones that were officially called for, definitely 7 Crusades. Some say up to 9. There's a couple other things, such as the Children's Crusade, which we'll look at, the Peasants' Crusade, which we'll look at briefly. So there's just a bunch of movements of Europeans to go free the Holy Land of the Muslims. And so as we launch into a study of the Crusades, we want to make sure we have a good foundation or a good introduction before we launch into the Crusades themselves. So on the screen you can see some introductory points. In regards to the Crusades, we must understand that Europe was Christian after the Holy Roman Empire was established, and definitely the rise of the Church and the Pope being the leader of the Church in Rome, and the different people groups and nations that solidified in Europe and then also in England. It was a Christian area. Christendom is called, Western Europe there, as it's Christian. But the land of Palestine, which is where Jerusalem is, and what we would say the Holy Land in regards to the time of the Crusades, but today where Jerusalem is in Israel, and there's Palestine, and there's Jordan and Syria, and all down towards Sinai with Egypt. That area there was the Holy Land, and it had special significance for the Christians in Europe. And there's 3 on the screen there, which are pretty obvious. First off, it's the home of Jesus Christ. So the Holy Land being where Bethlehem is, and Jerusalem, where Jesus Christ was crucified and buried and resurrected there in Jerusalem. And it was just the home of Jesus Christ. So it was a special place for European Christians. It was the birthplace of the church. That's where the church began, in Jerusalem, and then it spread out from that area to the different cities and all the way up into Asia Minor with the planting of churches by the Apostle Paul. And it continued to spread. So the church finds its roots also in the Holy Land. And so when you're talking about the church in Europe, they would look back at the Holy Land as being the place of the birthplace of the church. They believe that Peter was the first pope, and obviously he was there in Jerusalem. So this is the birthplace of the church, very important to them. And then thirdly, it was a place of pilgrimage. Now, pilgrimages to the Holy Land have been going on for a very long time. Remember, the Roman road system allowed a lot of travel to cross Europe, to cross Asia Minor, to go down into the Holy Land. And so for a long time, there were Christians making pilgrimages to Palestine because of it being an important area for the church and for Christians. But in the 7th century A.D., the Holy Land had fallen to the Muslims, but they still allowed pilgrimages. So even though the Holy Land was controlled by the Muslims to that early date in the 7th century, the Muslims, they still allowed the Christians to do their pilgrimages and come see the sites and do all of that. But that would change in 1000 A.D. The Seljuk Turks, who were Muslims, they gained power. And remember, Muslim is a follower of Islam. So different people groups can be called Muslims, but they're not unified. They're just unified in religion. Well, the Seljuk Turks, they were Muslims, and they invaded the land and conquered the Muslims that were there, and so they gained power. And what happened was, in the 11th century, Christian pilgrims who went from Europe to the Holy Land on pilgrimage, they would return to Europe, and they were giving these stories, telling these stories. Sometimes they were tales, they weren't even true, sometimes they were very exaggerated. But they were giving accounts that the Christians were being taxed unfairly and separately from the rest of the people that lived in the land. They had excessive road tolls that they had to pay, and there was no kind of laws that would control the road tolls. So someone could just set up a toll and collect money, and then right down the road again, someone else could set up another toll. So the Christians were being unfairly used, and then they were also telling stories of Christians being captured and tortured and killed. Again, some of this stuff was exaggerated, but they were saying these stories. So that's just some introduction to the Crusades. Before we move on, I want to show you a map here. Don't pay attention to really any of the lines yet. The lines, there's going to be a more simple map with lines on it coming up with the different Crusades. But you can see the area that we're talking about. So I'm going to move my cursor on the screen. So up here is Europe, and you have England and France and Spain or Spanish kingdoms. And here, actually, in this time period of 1095 to 1289, there were some Muslims had settled down here in southern Spain, making these Muslim states. But you can see you have Spain, you have France, the Holy Roman Empire, which is basically German. You have Italy down here, and England. And so this is Europe, this is Christendom, and you can see the Crusades would move this way down through what is Eastern Europe, and then north of Greece, and then across this little strait here. That's Constantinople, which was a very heavily sought after city. And then you can see the lines continue. And then, so down here is the Holy Land. And here's Jerusalem. Okay, Damascus. So that's where, remember, Saul, who would become Paul, he was traveling from Jerusalem. Here's my cursor. From Jerusalem up to Damascus, and he was converted on the road to Damascus. So that's what we're talking about right here. So here's the Holy Land, and that's where they want to free the Holy Land from the Muslims. Okay, so the call for the First Crusade. What took place? In 1071, the Seljuk Turks invaded the Byzantine Empire and beat the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert. The Seljuk Turks captured much of Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, and continued west and threatened Constantinople. Okay, so you can see here on the map, it says Seljuk Turks right there. So they invaded, they took all control of this whole area, and then they continued, and they were coming over here and they were basically threatening Constantinople, which was still in Byzantine hands. So in 1095, the Byzantine emperor appealed to Pope Urban II, and he called for the Council of Clermont. And at the Council of Clermont, he calls for a holy war or a crusade against the Muslims, which this would become the First Crusade. So here's a picture of the Council of Clermont, and clearly you can see it's medieval in its artwork. Again, very out of perspective. You can see how these guys are sitting around, and I mean, look at the size of these guys down here. This is their heads with caps on. I mean, they're tiny compared to the people right next to them. Just no perspective. But the point is, they're trying to show that a lot of people were there. And here's the Pope up there on the pulpit, and he's calling for the First Crusade, for this holy war. Okay, so before we move on into the actual Crusades, we need to look at the rationale for the Crusades. Now, this will be the rationale basically for all of them, but we're going to talk because we're coming up to the First Crusade, we'll talk about it now. But the rationale was to free the Holy Land from Muslim control, and you'll need to know these. To allow safe passage for pilgrims to go from Europe down to the Holy Land, because during this time it was a long journey. It was a dangerous journey. Like I said, the stories had returned to Europe that there was people being kidnapped, there were people being killed. Obviously, the taxes and tolls, so it wasn't a pleasant journey. Like, hey, we're going to travel through Europe. This is very dangerous. They could be robbed. A lot of different things could happen to them, but this would allow safe passage for pilgrims. It would rescue the Byzantines from the Turks. Okay, so the Byzantine Empire is what controlled like Constantinople, that area. So they would rescue the Byzantines. But notice privately, Urban II, he wanted to reunite the Eastern and Western parts of Christianity. So remember, you have Western Christianity, which is the Holy Roman Empire, Europe, Christendom, but then you have Eastern Christianity, which is basically from Constantinople and Greece over to the east, which would include like the Russian Orthodox, that kind of an area. So there was Eastern and Western Christianity. So Urban II, who was Western, he wanted to actually kind of combine the two, which would make him Pope over this massive area of Christianity. He wanted to basically heal this schism. Another rationale was people could gain spiritual merits, which we're going to see one coming up. A very important spiritual merit for the Crusaders. Unfortunately, it's not true. The rationale was also to follow the Old Testament examples of warfare. So what they did was the church looked at the Crusades as the same as warfare in the Old Testament, where Joshua crossed the Jordan River and basically invaded the Promised Land and conquered and defeated different peoples that were in the Promised Land. At Jericho, at Ai, different campaigns that Joshua did there in the book of Joshua. And then another rationale was to stop warring between feudal lords in Europe. So remember, we had talked about this last time. You have the different layers of the social order. So you have kings and nobles and knights and then serfs. Well, the feudal lords, the nobles and knights would sometimes fight against one another, attack their neighbor because they weren't getting along, maybe take some of his fields, take some of his land. Well, the feudal lords in Europe, they had warred against each other, and so this was to try to keep them from fighting and actually stop the war in Europe, fight a common enemy, which would be the Muslims. Okay, so a couple general facts of the Crusades. It was definitely one of the darkest days in Christianity because these crusaders were going under the banner of Christ to clear the Holy Land of the Muslims. But what they did was they basically massacred. They just massacred populations. They did a lot of damage, and also as they traveled, they needed food, they needed equipment, they needed supplies, and they basically just started rummaging and rampaging through Europe as they traveled, just taking what they wanted, leaving Europe basically in shambles as they moved through a town. So it was a dark day in Christianity. Muslims use this as a black mark on Christianity. They basically go all the way back to this and say that Christianity is not a peaceful religion. It was a warlike religion and wanted to kill Muslims. The Crusades lasted from 1096 to 1272 AD, so almost 200 years of Crusades. As I said a few minutes ago, there were 7 official crusades. There were several that were unofficial, such as the Peasants' Crusade, Children's Crusade. There were some others. But there were 7 official crusades. On most of the crusades, this is a common thing between the crusades, on most of them there was no real established leader. Usually the crusades were led by several leaders, and that caused all kinds of problems because usually it was different armies that would be collected by different countries led by their own leaders, maybe a king, and the crusades they didn't just have one leader. If anything, if you want to think about it this way, if anything, the leader of the crusades was basically the Pope, because the popes were the ones that called for the crusades and gained a lot of power out of the crusades. Okay, so this is the first one we're going to look at. It's called the Peasant Crusade. Now I need to mention, very important, notice on the screen it says it's an unofficial crusade. This takes place before the First Crusade. And the reason is because these peasants, who were basically landless peasants, they didn't have any land or anything like that. They worked the land, but they didn't have anything. They decided to leave to go fight for the Pope. So it's an unofficial crusade. It takes place before the First Crusade was organized to leave for the Holy Land. So the Pope called for the crusade. They're trying to get it organized, and these peasants decide we're going to go. And so they go, and they're led by Peter the Hermit. Thousands of peasants follow Peter the Hermit, and they're going to go down there and kick the Muslims. And these Muslims aren't just like, some people living in tents. They've been there for a while, and there's armies. They're warriors, and these peasants think they're going to go down there and kick the Muslims out. Well, what happened is they made it to Constantinople, and after they cross through Constantinople, they all are slaughtered. The entire crusade stops there. They're slaughtered, and that is it for the Peasant Crusade. So I'm going to go back real quick. Just bear with me on the screen to the map. Okay, so the peasants are collected from Europe, and they come down, and it's not there's no line on the map for the Peasant Crusade. But they come down, and here is Constantinople. So they make it to Constantinople, and again, remember the Turks are right over here. They're right there, and they get slaughtered. So that is the end of the Peasant Crusades. So let me go back. Peasant Crusades. That's it. The end of that. Okay, so let's talk about the First Crusade, 1095 to 1099. So there's the time periods, 1095 to 1099. Urban II stated it was God's will to retake the Holy Land. And so remember, back in this time, the Pope had great power over the church and over kings and basically was God's mouthpiece on earth. And so Urban II stated, well, I got a direct link to God, and God told me that it is God's will to retake the Holy Land. So he declares a very bold and untrue decree. He declared a total remission of sins for all that went on the crusade. So he is basically saying that he can forgive all sins, and with the idea of remission of sins, especially when you look in the Bible where it talks about the only way that you can have remission of sins is through blood, a blood sacrifice, meaning the Old Testament blood sacrifice of the animal, the blemish-free animal, and for the Old Covenant, and clearly for remission of sins, for salvation, under the New Covenant of the spotless blood of Jesus Christ, as Christ gave himself for us on the cross. So you think about what the Pope has just declared. He's declared total remission of sins if you go on a crusade. If you go on this holy war, you'll be saved, and if you die on it, then you're good to go. You'll be in heaven. It didn't just stop with the Crusaders. It was also extended to people who could not go on the crusade, but sponsored or paid for someone else to go. So let's say a nobleman just has a lot of things going on. He's really rich. He owns a lot of land. He's living a good life, and maybe he's not really the adventurous type. And he decides, I can't go on this crusade, but I want my sins remitted. I want remission of sins. So he'll pay maybe one of his lords under him, maybe a knight under him, to go on the crusade for him. So he pays or sponsors that knight to go for him. So not only does the knight have remission of sins as per the Pope, but also the nobleman who pays for the knight to go, he also has remission of sins. So again, it's just this way of recruiting people to go on this mission for the Pope. Not true, obviously. It's just a way that they were able to recruit soldiers. It also shows a use of spiritual leverage for the Pope to get or do what he wanted. And this happened before, maybe in minor ways, but from here on, it would be rampant that the Pope would use spiritual decrees to get basically political leverage, whether it be with a king or a country. They would do all kinds of things spiritually to get kings or people within countries to do what they wanted. For example, excommunication. They would excommunicate a king, saying you're not going to go to heaven because the king made the Pope upset, didn't do what the Pope said, whatever it was. And so the Pope would then excommunicate that king, so a spiritual sanction because the king didn't do something politically. And on the First Crusade is the famous robes that the Crusaders would wear, this whitish kind of robe with a red cross on it, the Crusaders' cross on it. So that's what we think of with the Crusades. Okay, so the First Crusade continuing. 1096, the Crusaders defeated near Nicaea. So they start off pretty poor. They go and they're actually beaten in Nicaea. But in 1097, they reorganize, they capture Nicaea, they capture Iconium, and they lay siege to Antioch. A year later, in 1098, they take Antioch, but a large Muslim force arrives and surrounds the Crusaders. So now you have the Crusaders under siege. And these Crusaders, as they're under siege, one of them has a vision of a holy lance. And I don't have time. This video is going to be longer anyway, but I don't have time to go into the story of the Holy Lance. A lot of it is folklore, but they have this one Crusader has a vision of this Holy Lance, which is buried, and they have to go and dig it up, and they're going to take this Holy Lance into battle with them, and they will defeat the Muslims. So wherever they get a lance from, they have this lance. They say it's the Holy Lance. They use it in the battle. They attack the Muslims, and they beat the Muslims. But the issue is that they actually attacked and surprised the Muslims with this attack. It was more of a surprise attack that allowed them to beat the Muslims than this Holy Lance. But they attack the Muslims, and the Muslims flee, and they leave behind all of their women and supplies. And so the Crusaders take the women and take the supplies. But one of the activities of a conquering people is that the soldiers usually will violate the women that are captured. But the Crusaders didn't do that here. They would definitely rape women later on when they invade the Holy Land. But here, when they invade Jerusalem. But here, one of the Crusaders, there's an account, and he says, "We did nothing evil to them," meaning the women, which means they didn't rape the women. "We did nothing evil to them. We just speared them through." So these are Christians who have now taken the Muslim women outside of Antioch, and they slaughtered the women. Okay, here's kind of a simple map with the lines on it. And so the red lines, you can see here it says First Crusade. You can see they come down through. There was one group that comes down through Rome, and there's another group that comes down through this way, and they go to Constantinople, then they cross over. Here's Nicaea. Okay, and then they continue on, and here's Antioch. Okay. And then over here's Edessa. That's another name coming up. All right, so that's the travel route, or the way that they came down through into the Holy Land in the First Crusade. All right, so continuing on with the First Crusade. In 1099, the Crusaders attacked Jerusalem, and they kill soldiers, civilians, men, women, children, Jews, Egyptian Muslims who came up from Egypt to help the Turks. So they basically came in, they attacked Jerusalem, they ended up taking Jerusalem, and they slaughter the Muslims that are there. There are accounts of the Crusaders, and as Christians, we don't want to say anything bad about these guys because they were Christians going and fighting to kick the Muslims out of the Holy Land. But the issue was they did horrific things. They were very violent. They were warriors. They were out on mission, so they're no longer back home in the castle in England or Europe watching over their lands. Now they're actually out on a mission. And they have permission to kill and slaughter and show their power. And they did. There's accounts of babies being thrown off of walls. That's supposed to say from walls. That's a typo there on the screen, but it's from walls. They raped women in Jerusalem. They burned people alive. They cut off the heads and hands and feet of people and piled them up in the streets. So just a lot of violence in this First Crusade. Okay, so they captured Jerusalem. And this caused it to be the most successful crusade of all of them. Of all the crusades there were, this was the most successful, the first one. It showed that the Pope had military power. The Pope could call for an army, and the army would be there. They established the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, and that was an official name for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. That was the city of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. It became like a vassal state of Europe, and so it was basically a little outpost in the Holy Land of Europe. That's basically what it was. The Muslims still had the other lands around, but there was this belonged to Europe. But several years later, the Muslims returned and would recapture much of the Holy Land, but they would not recapture Jerusalem just yet. Okay, the Jerusalem still remained in the hands of the Crusaders for now. Okay, so here's just a artwork of Jerusalem in the First Crusade. You can see you can definitely see the European influence here in the art. These are Europeans. They have the cross of Christ on their robes. Here's a warrior there. Here's like dead Muslims laying there. You can see Muslim architecture here in the picture. So they're rescuing Jerusalem from the Muslims. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149. The goal was to retake Edessa from the Muslims. And that previous map, I think I have one coming up. Here it is. Here's Edessa down here. Okay, so that's the plan, is to rescue Odessa from the Muslims, which they had taken back. 1145, Pope Eugenius III calls for the Second Crusade. So again, he wants an army. The Pope calls for it. Next year, Bernard of Clairvaux was a powerful mystic, and he was a monk, and he traveled throughout France and Germany calling for crusaders to join this movement. In 1147, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, they leave for the Holy Land with their armies. And as they go, Conrad III is beaten by the Turks. So the remaining forces that he has joins up with Louis VII's army to attack Damascus. So again, we're down there in the Holy Land now. They failed and retreated. And they retreat to, there's supposed to be a space there, retreat to Jerusalem, and that ends the crusade. So the Second Crusade is a complete bust. They take two armies down there separately. One is beaten, joins up with the other army. They go to take Damascus, but they fail, and they have to retreat to Jerusalem. Again, Jerusalem was still in the hands of the Europeans, and so they retreat to the European state there in Jerusalem, and that ends the Second Crusade. And there's a picture of it there. Second Crusade is this green line, so they come down through, they come this way, and they end up, so here's Damascus, they end up retreating to Jerusalem. That's what they did. And you can see here the orange lines. Those are boundaries of Crusader states. So this area here belongs to Europe. So they retreated from Damascus to Europe. Okay, so the Second Crusade was a bust. So now we're going to go to the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192. In 1187, Jerusalem is captured by Saladin and is heavily supported and actually heavily fortified. So 1187, Jerusalem is taken, so Europe does not have Jerusalem anymore. The same year, Pope Gregory VII calls for a crusade to recapture Jerusalem. And in 1189, three kings lead this crusade with their separate armies. You have Frederick I of Germany, Philip II of France, and Richard I, also known as Richard the Lionheart, of England. So you may know that name, maybe from Robin Hood, but Richard I, or Richard the Lionheart, he goes on crusade to the Holy Land. So in 1190, Frederick's army captures Iconium, but he drowns while crossing a river, and his troops kind of disperse. Some of them return home, some of them go and settle in other parts of Europe, and some of them actually join up and try to join up with Richard and Philip. So Frederick's army just kind of is gone. But Richard and Philip continue on to the Holy Land. And there's a picture of one of the kings. I'm not sure who it is, but one of the kings there on his way on the Third Crusade. So continuing on, Philip attacks Acre, and Richard attacks Cyprus, which is an island. And Richard wins. He captures Cyprus, and he continues on and joins Philip in the capture of Acre. After they capture Acre, Philip leaves, and Richard the Lionheart remains in command, but then he ends up departing also. But Richard Richard the Lionheart executes 2,700 Muslims in Acre. So Richard the Lionheart, he departs Acre, and he attacks Saladin's army and continues on and captures Jaffa. And this is important. In 1192, this basically ends the crusade. Richard and Saladin make a treaty. So instead of completely kicking out the Muslims from the Holy Land, Richard and Saladin make this treaty, and that ends the Third Crusade. Well, this treaty does some things. The treaty gave a strip of land down the eastern Mediterranean coast, which would become the Crusader kingdom. The Muslims would retain Jerusalem, so they would keep Jerusalem, which that's a big deal, that they would keep Jerusalem. And the treaty would make Acre now the new capital of the Crusader kingdom. Okay, so I'm going to go back to that map. So down here is Acre, right there, and here's Jerusalem. And basically what would happen is the Muslims would keep Jerusalem, and the Crusaders would have Acre, and they would have this strip of land down the coast that would be in the hands of the Crusaders. And that would be now a strip of land of the Crusader kingdom, which would basically be, this would be European land. The Europeans would control it, but the Muslims would still control Jerusalem, and now the new capital is Acre. Let me go back to our slide. The next year, in 1193, Saladin dies, and the Muslims have internal conflict. Now, the crusade ended with the treaty, but the result of this treaty, even though it sounds like they did a lot of things, you have Richard the Lionheart out on crusade, so he's a popular guy, a famous guy, and they took these lands and they took some of the cities, they captured Acre and all, and they have this treaty now, and it sounds like it was kind of successful, but really it was not successful. All it did was they were able to capture some minor cities. They signed this treaty that basically didn't kick the Muslims out of the Holy Land. It just kind of made some peace, and they have some land there. It was no major victory, and it would just set up for further crusades to come after it. So that's it for the Third Crusade. There's the map. Okay, now the Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204. This was called by Pope Innocent III, and the goal was to capture Jerusalem. Again, the treaty that was signed by Richard the Lionheart and Saladin gave control of the city to the Muslims, the city of Jerusalem. So the goal here was to recapture Jerusalem. And this call by Innocent III, it shows something. Notice the third point on the screen. This crusade proved that a call to holy war was just a demonstration of a power grab. Okay, so it was just the Pope saying, we're doing this, and it just showed his power. And the armies were going to assemble under the command of the Pope, and they were going to go free Jerusalem of the Muslims. So the plan was to go and attack Egypt because they were supporting the Muslims in the Holy Land. If they attack Egypt, that'll undermine the Muslims' power there. Meanwhile, boats from Venice, Italy, would move a Crusader army to the Holy Land. So while they're being distracted down there in Egypt, another army is going to come across from Italy and attack the Holy Land. But the problem was the Crusaders ran out of money to be able to pay the shipping fare of their army. The merchant boats, the ships that they would have when they got to Italy, when the armies moved to Italy, to the coast, to a port city, they would need ships, and these ships would have to be hired. They wouldn't do it for free. They would have to be hired to transport the armies to the Holy Land. But they didn't have enough money to hire the ships. So the Venetians, so now we're in Venice, Italy, the Venetians asked the Crusaders to attack a rival Christian city called Zara as compensation. So they would be, hey, I will take your army to the Holy Land if you first attack this city, and we can have compensation from that, and then we'll take you to the Holy Land. Well, this army attacked. So now you have a Christian army of Crusaders attacking a Christian city so that they can continue on for their holy war. Not a good idea in regards to the Pope. The Pope is very angry and excommunicates the entire army. So now you have an army on crusade who they have their sins remitted, their sins forgiven by the Pope. This same army is now excommunicated by the Pope because they attacked this Christian city. Well, the Venetians urged the army to continue on to Constantinople. Forget about the Pope, just continue on, and we can set up a Venetian king in Constantinople. So they're basically usurping the Pope. So I'm going to go back to the map. The Third Crusade is, the Fourth Crusade is this purple line. And so after attacking Zara, which it's up here somewhere, the other map actually had it on there. But the purple line, they're going to take the ships, they're going to go down through here, go up to Constantinople. This is called the Strait of Dardanelles. And they're going to go to Constantinople. And just a fun point, Constantinople is today's city of Istanbul. Istanbul, Turkey, is Constantinople. Well, anyway, the Venetians say, hey, we'll take you down to Constantinople if you will, when you beat Constantinople, then we will put a Venetian king, we'll go to the right slide, there we go, we will put a Venetian king on the throne in Constantinople. Well, what happened is the campaign didn't go as planned. They go down to Constantinople, they end up sacking the city, and it just delves into a fractured mess. The army they're fighting amongst one another. They fight against different leaders there. We don't have time to get into it, but it just completely implodes on itself. And the Crusaders never even did reach the Crusader kingdom in the Holy Land. It just kind of like fizzled out there in Constantinople, and that was it. On the bottom of this slide, it's a very important point. After the Fourth Crusade, the remaining Crusades ended in complete failure. I mean, we're not even going to go over the remaining official Crusades because they're just complete failures. This Fourth Crusade, it shows the power of the Pope. It shows that they did actually go and take Constantinople, but the rest of these Crusades end in complete failure. We are going to talk about one more crusade. This was an unofficial crusade. It's called the Children's Crusade. It happened in 1212. It was 1 year long because of what took place. The reason I bring this up is because of how unique it is. It's called the Children's Crusade. So the first unofficial crusade was the Peasant Crusade, where you had peasants with this idea they're going to go kick out these warriors out of the Holy Land. Well, in 1212, you now have children who say they're going to do it. They were basically teenagers, but some of them were quite young. They said they were going to go kick out the warriors out of the Holy Land, and by now, these warriors in the Holy Land are battle-hardened warriors. So these children they're just led into their demise. Thousands of teenagers leave Europe on a crusade to free the Holy Land of Muslims. They are led by it was kind of like two movements that came together. One was led by a teenager named Nicholas, who was from Germany, and another one was from France. His name was Stephen, and he was actually 12 years old. And they mobilize teenagers to go on this crusade. The historical accounts are that monks also accompanied them and helped support them and guide them and counsel them on what to do, and helped the children to be able to get food when they came into a town so they didn't starve. But these leaders, they led these teenagers. The teenagers believed that only the pure and the innocent could retake the Holy Land. So before, it was these knights, it was these warriors, these soldiers going down there to fight. Well, now they're like, forget about that. Only the pure and the innocent can retake the Holy Land. So because of Nicholas and Stephen, 30,000 teenagers mobilize in Europe, and they move down into northern Italy. They had to cross the Alps, basically, and come into northern Italy, and they come to the Mediterranean Sea. And that is where they had this idea. Their idea was that they thought that the Mediterranean Sea would part, and they would have dry land across the Mediterranean from Italy all the way to the Holy Land, kind of like Moses crossing the Red Sea. Well, obviously that did not happen. The Mediterranean Sea did not part. Here's a picture of the Children's Crusade being led here. Maybe that is Nicholas or Stephen. You can see that there's a very spiritual aspect to it. This would be Mary with the Christ child. You have a cross leading. You have these pious children praying here in the wagon. So just some artwork there of the Children's Crusade. As I said, the Mediterranean Sea does not part ways, and the children are then promised passage on a lot of ships. They got these ships there at the port, and these ships are owned by Hugh the Iron and William of Porscherus. Now, these two guys are merchants, so all they want is money. So they load these children onto the ships. Now, we don't know how many children it was. It was a lot of children. But when the Mediterranean Sea did not part, some of the children actually turned around and went home. Okay, so they were in Italy, they turned around, they went home, but there were still a lot of children that decided we're going to continue on the ships to the Holy Land. Well, Hugh the Iron and William of Porscherus, they load the children on their ships, the ships depart, and the children are never heard from again. Now, there are accounts that these children were sold into slavery, and this came from some of the teenagers that were sold into slavery years later, actually escaped and returned to Europe over the Alps. So even though these children were never heard from again, the only reason that the belief is they were sold into slavery was that some of them escaped and returned to tell the story. But these children, this crusade, they didn't even get close to the Holy Land. These children were sold into slavery. And you just think about First off, why in the world would the parents allow their children to go on a crusade? They're teenagers from Europe, but then their child leaves the fief, leaves the farm, and is never heard of again. On this map here, we can kind of see, and there's some other lines here from the other Crusades, but notice right here, see the cursor on the screen, it says Children's Crusade. That's this one right here. Okay, so basically throughout Europe, so we have France here and Germany here, the children are gathered together under their leaders, and they move down, which was the leaders were Nicholas and Stephen. They move down, and basically they get to here in this will be like northern Italy, and that's it. They don't know where they are after that. They were sold into slavery. So the Children's Crusade ended right here. As you see my cursor moving on the map, and you can see the map there of the lines of the other Crusades. And you can look up your own maps online. There's a lot of information about the Crusades. And then, like I said, we're not going to talk about it, but the 5th, 6th, 7th Crusades, they all failed. You can see here, and, this is the other Crusades. They're all over the place down here. They're bouncing back and forth and fighting and dying and not getting anywhere. So the Crusades just were not good, the 5th, 6th, and 7th. Okay, so let's talk about the effects of the Crusades. The kings increased power and land holdings. And what that means is when noblemen left their land in Europe and knights left their land in Europe, they controlled an area of land with farms on it and fields, and had a little village, and they lived in the castle or the manor house or whatever. They lived on that fiefdom. When the nobles or the knights, when they left their land, some of them, or actually many of them, were killed on the Crusades. They died in battle. Well, their lands, now that they no longer have a noble or a knight in charge, that left those lands susceptible to being taken by other noblemen who didn't go on crusade. Maybe a neighbor would take their land. And, the family that lived there would basically have no power to do anything about it, especially if the son of the nobleman was too young to really have any kind of power or sway, or maybe they were just a weak heir to the land. And nobles would take land, and sometimes kings would actually just take their land holdings of the nobles that went and died in battle. Another effect was it increased trade between Asia, and there's another typo. Sorry about that. I typed up this slide pretty fast. Increased trade between the East and the West. So between Europe and Asia, there was trade. It introduced new products into Europe. Spices, silk, oranges, other exotic fruits came into Europe. Some new sciences entered Europe. There are Arabic numerals. There was algebra, architecture. All of that came into Europe. Religious persecution increased. There's this event called the Reconquista that was basically to kick Muslims out of the southern part of Spain. There was these Muslim states down there. And so it was basically a persecution that took place against the Muslims by the Christians to kick the Muslims out of Spain. And then there was the Inquisition, and that would continue on for a long time, where the church begins to attack anyone in opposition to the church. So that would be persecution from the church towards those that disagree with them. Maybe it's Jews. It could also be Christians. The point is, it begins here out of the Crusades, and it would continue on for centuries. I mean, you just think about the Reformation and the persecution that the Catholic Church did to the reformers and even the reformers themselves. It was just a bad situation for that. And that is it for part 4. A very long PowerPoint today. I will see you just in a minute. Okay, class, and that's going to be it for our videos for this semester. Again, take a look on Moodle for the study guide for the final exam. Before I sign off here on this video, I just want to just tell you thank you for enrolling at Mid-America, enrolling in World History 1, and participating as you did in the class and on Moodle and through emails with me and questions that you've emailed me. It's been good to get to know some of you over emails and see what's kind of going on in your lives. And I just want to thank you for doing that. Also, for your hard work on papers. I know that some of the papers may not have gone as well, especially the first one. If you remember back to that video, and I shared with you some of the results of the papers in regards to some of the tips to improve on the second one, on the second paper. The information on history is good. It's good to know. It's one of my favorite academic pursuits, basically outside of theology, because I'm here at Mid-America myself as a student. If you remember when I introduced myself videos back, many videos ago, that I am a student in the PhD program here at Mid-America, and I know what you're going through when it comes to papers. I have been where you were, or where you are, where I wrote a paper and the professor really slammed it, but the information I knew the information, but sometimes just writing it down, it was a little more difficult putting it into words on paper. But I promise you, if you stick to it and you follow the writing tips that you're learning, you will get better at writing your papers, and I am proof of it. I was not a very good writer when I started out in my college journey, and here I am today. Never thought I would ever be a PhD student, but here I am today, a PhD student, and I actually have a 30-page paper due to my professor here at the end of this coming week. I feel your pain. I know how it is for you. But the point is, I want you to improve on your writing. I graded the papers according to the rubric that is in your syllabus, and on the new grading scale. And I hope that the tips, the comments that I made, the corrections I made on your papers, I hope that it was helpful to you, that you'll be able to make those corrections. And on future papers, think about those kind of errors, and that you wouldn't be making those in the future. A lot of times, it takes practice, and you'll get through it. But I really enjoyed reading your research, and so I want to thank you for the hard work you did on your papers. I do hope that you enjoyed the videos. Again, like I said in my first video, it's difficult sometimes to make history interesting, especially when it's PowerPoint. But unfortunately, with history, it's kind of like an information download into your brain, because you just have to know information. Here it is. This is what you got to know. So I do hope that the videos were interesting for you, and I don't know what your plans are for the future. This is World History 1, and Mid-America will have World History 2. I'll be teaching that in the spring of 2020. We have World History 2. So maybe some of you will enroll in that, and I'll be able to teach you the time period from 1500 up to basically the present day, 2001. 9/11 is the ending time that we look at for World History 2, because that's kind of like a big event that takes place. So maybe you'll sign up or enroll in World History 2, and I'll be able to teach you then also. But other than that, That's all we have. Thank you so much for being in this class. Take care.